Good morning, everybody. My name's Andrew Feehan. I work with Enable HR, and I'll be moderating today's session and also our Q&A. Just want to thank everybody for joining our session today. It's a very important session. Some really great content and topics are going to be covered. So very much looking forward to the session today. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers for today. So firstly, we have Campbell Fisher. I might actually ask the speakers to chuck on their cameras for us. Thanks, guys. Firstly, we have Campbell Fisher. Campbell is the Executive Chairman of Enable HR. He has over 25 years experience in providing ASX 100 private companies and public sector clients with high-level strategic advice. He's one of only 2 lawyers in Australia to be an accredited specialist in employment and industrial law in both New South Wales and Victoria. Highly regarded by both the legal and business communities, not only because of his expertise in workplace relations law, but also for his innovative approach to the delivery of legal services. So Campbell primarily assists boards and senior executives to formulate business-oriented solutions that are underpinned by his very practical understanding of how businesses operate and the commercial and organisational forces that drive growth. So thanks for joining us, Cam. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Tracy Angwin. Tracy's the CEO of the Australian Payroll Association. Tracy is a solutions expert, media commentator, and popular keynote speaker, and the driving force behind the Australian Payroll Association. Tracy is also the best-selling author of The Payroll Revolution, published in 2013, and Profit from Payroll, published in 2015. She is sought out for her commentary and guidance on all payroll topics, including why employers get payroll wrong, optimizing the payroll function, and the future of payroll. And finally, I'd like to introduce Maureen Keane. Maureen is the Director of Advisory and Transformation at WFS Australia. So as a leader with over 20 years experience in the HR software industry, Maureen has worked for leading HCM software providers such as Workforce Software and SAP SuccessFactors. Her career has offered valuable experience in solution development and delivery, working in large multinational customers across Europe, South Africa, and Asia Pacific and Japan. She joined WFS Australia in 2018 to provide our partners and customers practical advice and guidance for workforce management transformation projects. She's passionate about helping businesses navigate workforce management best practices with the aid of technology to ensure compliance. So just before I throw over to Cam to kick us off, just some quick housekeeping. We're actually going to have some polls during one of the sessions. The first will be during Cam's session at the beginning. So we encourage everybody to participate and get involved in those polls. We certainly want this to be interactive and value your feedback. Also, during the sessions, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a Q&A button. So during the sessions, please feel free to submit questions using that particular button. And we have a dedicated 30 minutes at the end of the presentations where we will go into the Q&A process as well. So we'll try and get through as many of the questions as we can, but we'll certainly try post session to provide some responses to questions that we may miss. So once again, thank you all for coming, and I'll pass over to you, Cam.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, I'm going to focus mostly on things that touch on workforce strategy, and I guess provide the framework within which people will deploy HR tech or HR payroll kinds of solutions. Talk a little bit about predicting the future of workplace relations in Australia. So I think probably everybody's probably sitting out there feeling less certain about the future than we were in the beginning of March, and probably a fair bit more stressed and anxious about what the future holds for us in our workplaces. But we do know some things. We can predict some things as a business premise. One is that many businesses will probably get their revenue from different sources in the future than in the past, and that will require lots of businesses to adapt and change to those circumstances. A second premise is that most businesses will move to strengthen their balance sheets and cash flow, because they're the things that business needs to survive prolonged economic downturns. And the third is that most businesses will try and lower their cost base, or where they can't lower their cost base, at least build flexibility into it. And a lot of the kind of policy reform in industrial relations will be focused on building that flexibility in, or finding ways to actually lower labour cost bases in businesses. So I thought to start off, we might do a quick poll around the 5 policy areas that the government is proposing to initiate, so that we can get a quick kind of feel for what's of most interest to business in Australia. So we'll just keep the poll open for about 20 or 30 seconds to allow you to respond and for the system to collate those results, and then we'll share them on the screen so that we can at least make sure we focus in on the things that are most important to people during the session. So here we go. Award simplification seems to be the biggest, but closely followed by casual and fixed term employees and compliance and enforcement, enterprise agreements, and then, yes, there's only a few people in industries where greenfields agreements are relevant. That's good. We'll address all those kinds of issues for people as we go through. I thought I'd start by trying to find an evidence base for what the future will hold, both from an economic perspective and particularly in relation to unemployment, as the two are kind of integrally linked. These forecasts are actually produced by the Reserve Bank of Australia. Over on the left-hand side, it's gross domestic product, which is really the key measure of economic growth, economic prosperity, at an aggregate level for an economy. And the kind of purple line was showing how we were going before the pandemic hit. Then sorry, we've got one too many. Then the kind of vertical line really shows the intervening point in the middle of March of the pandemic and the social distancing impact. And then the 3 graphs, the kind of amber one is really showing an optimistic forecast. The baseline is, I guess, the most likely forecast, at least at the time that this was done. And the brown kind of line is the downside forecast. And so what this graph shows that, even under all 3 scenarios, it's unlikely that we'll get back to our pre-COVID economic position for over 2 years. And so we're in a pretty prolonged cycle of difficult economic times, and the workforce strategies that we will deploy over the next couple of years will need to be cognizant of the fact that economic times will be really challenging. The one thing that's happened since these forecasts were cast was we've had the additional kind of second wave challenge in Victoria. And so if anything, we're likely to have a slightly deeper and more prolonged economic challenge as a result of the position in Victoria, which is extremely challenging, particularly for that state. Over on the right-hand side, we're looking at kind of levels of employment. And again, we've had a once in a century dislocation to the labour market. About 1 million people lost their jobs in a week or two. And what happens when you get such a large structural adjustment is it actually takes a long time for the economy to build that level of underlying employment back in. And you can see from the 3 lines, downside, baseline and upside, you're well past that 2-year mark before you're getting anything like back to the levels of employment that we saw pre-COVID. So the government's been quite quite canny in the way that they've approached the workplace policy change issue, in terms of they haven't come out with an elaborate policy framework which they're pushing from an ideological perspective. They've really set up a process where the parties can have dialogue first. There is a really good environment for change, though. We're obviously in the biggest crisis, certainly in my working career, and crisis normally compels change, greater change and more rapid change. And in fact, the health crisis has compelled us to work in a very, very different way to the way that we were working before COVID hit. And there's probably not anybody on this call who isn't working extremely differently. At FCB, we're predominantly working from home. We've had a flexible work policy for over a couple of years, but really it was about 15% of us on any day were using that workforce flexibility, and 85% were working, more traditionally. And in about 48 hours, we really moved where probably only 5% of people were working location-based traditional structures, and 95% of people changed. The economic crisis also compels us to change the basis upon which we work. So not the way we work, but the basis upon which we work. And particularly, there's been major restructuring in both hours and salary arrangements. If you add to this mix the kind of global position, geopolitical tensions were present pre-COVID, but have really escalated between the two major economies in the US and China. We've had supply chain disruption, and I guess people have started to see the vulnerability that they have to particular markets in their supply chain. We're facing the uncertainty of the second wave. In Australia, it's very delicately placed. We've had some pretty optimistic recent information around the probability of a vaccine, but you're still looking at the back half of 21 before it's likely to be, globally distributable on a best case scenario. And one of the things that people don't talk about very much in the Australian context is a lot of the economic growth we've experienced over the last 5 to 10 years has been because of the skilled migrant intake, and that's going to really, really dry up, and that in itself is going to be a significant economic impact from a negative perspective for the Australian economy. So what's the government policy response so far? And I think when we talk about this, as well as just talking about the policy, what it actually is, understanding the government's thinking behind the policy is critically important to predicting where we're likely to go in the future. And so one of the really smart things that the Liberal government did nationally was to set up the formation of the National Cabinet to try and solve the response to the crisis in a coordinated national framework in circumstances where the health solution and the health orders were regulated by state governments, and obviously most of the fiscal support came from the federal government. So it's been really successful, and the government's entrenched that framework so that the National Cabinet will be ongoing. And I guess you can contrast the way Australia's responded to the crisis to that of the US, where again they run a federation, albeit a much bigger and more complex federation, but you've just seen the inability for them to coordinate national responses and the impact that that's had. Perhaps the Liberal government learnt from the bushfire crisis and went in early, and it's been a really successful thing. So we've seen JobSeeker and JobKeeper work really successfully together. Obviously, JobSeeker, a social safety net for people who are unemployed, put a lot of money in a short space of time for people who'd been dislocated from employment, and JobKeeper let businesses really keep those people who are critical to our future success huddled around us, through the really difficult economic time, so that when business comes back, we've got that kind of competency available and close to us, and we can bring it online. The decision to extend the programs, was really welcomed by business. Obviously, it gives us a lot longer to translate as an economy and businesses operating within the economy to readjust our workforces to what we need in the future. And it also means that it keeps a fair bit of fiscal stimulus in the hands of consumers, and they'll keep spending, and we need that kind of consumer confidence and spending to keep the economy bubbling along. the future is really all about how many jobs we can make within the economy, how quickly, and most of the future programs for the government are really looking to try and stimulate business investment and stimulate jobs. And so when we look at the IR reform agenda, and I guess also, you know, tax reform, we're really looking for the government to create an environment where we can invest, and by investing we'll create jobs, confidence and spending, and hopefully you know, sail through the COVID crisis in reasonable shape. So what are the areas that the government's already looking at? We've had short-term JobKeeper stand-down provisions. So stand-down provisions are things that have been in industrial law for a long time, but rarely used. You know, practicing as a lawyer for 25 years, I probably had only made one stand-down application in 25 years before COVID hit. And the classic definition was when you couldn't use your workforce through no fault of your own, and you know, a classic example would be a major power outage for a manufacturer. You could apply and get a stand-down order. So we've had short-term JobKeeper stand-downs, which let us, by right, you know, vary hours and pay of employees where we can't fully utilise them. And I guess that contrasts to the position prior to this, where you'd have to do that previously through kind of consultation agreement only. So the government's proposed, and it looks like it will get bilateral support, to extend the JobKeeper stand-down provisions out to the end of March. And it will require some further statutory amendments, so it's not guaranteed. And it looks like it will be limited to people who will continue to qualify, employers who will continue to qualify for the JobKeeper provisions. And we know there's been that tightening up of eligibility criteria there around the degradation of employment and how that's measured. As well as that, the Attorney General announced 5 working groups to look at, you know, some of the big ticket items that are really causing challenge in our economy at the moment. So, you know, with the casuals and fixed term employees position, you know, the decision of Workpac and Risotto, which really just kind of changed the way that we classically looked at casual employment. So historically, casual employment was, you know, somebody who was engaged and paid as such would be casual, they'd get the loading, and you wouldn't have to pay them the kind of permanent entitlements. That decision turned all that around, and so there is an appeal up in the High Court, where the High Court, you know, may overturn that decision, but they may not. If they don't overturn it, then really it will require statutory remedy from the government to alleviate the impact of that. And there have been estimates up as high as $14 billion in back pay payment associated with that. Award simplification, you know, awards are simply not simple. They're perhaps more simple than we used to have when we had a multiplicity of state and federal awards, but it causes great kind of compliance challenge for all businesses, just given the complexity of the provisions. The enterprise agreement system in Australia is pretty fundamentally broken. I'll talk a little bit more about that. For greenfields agreements, they're mostly associated with aligning capital investment in major projects, particularly in building and construction and infrastructure. And compliance and enforcement is probably the thing that at FCB Group we spend more time with these days, as you know, it seems like businesses of all sizes are really struggling with that compliance and enforcement regime, overlaid with the complexity of the legal system. And I'll try and set out a bit of a framework for people to think about when they're deploying payroll solutions or any kind of HR tech solution in terms of how you need to set that up. So we've got bipartisan representation in these working groups, wrestling through those kinds of issues. You know, the meeting started in June, meant to report at the end of September, and we know on October 6th we have the next budget from the federal government, and perhaps there's some alignment around what we get through that working group process and the budget. So if we're looking at the compliance challenge, you know, what I've tried to do in this one page is set out, you know, where most businesses kind of get it wrong. So over on the right-hand side, most large organisations have obviously a payroll solution, a time and attendance rostering kind of structure, and Human Resources Information System, HRIS system. And we need to set up those HR tech enabling tools consistent with the sources of legal obligation that businesses in Australia have. And so you've got the National Employment Standard, pretty prescriptive set of national minimums, quite rigidly written. Most businesses will have modern awards which will apply to them, maybe more than one, and can be very complex. And then some businesses step into the enterprise bargaining stream and vary conditions at a site or across an enterprise specific to that enterprise. Then we have how the employees actually work. And often this is where businesses get into trouble, where the way that the payroll or HR tech solutions are set up is aligned to the legal framework, but then people are actually working differently on site or differently in workplaces than we thought they were when we set the HR tech solutions up originally. And often it's around annualised salaries and that kind of thing, where people are just working different hours arrangements than we aligned with a payroll system. And so over on the right-hand side, I've tried to set out the major things that people get wrong and we kind of see every day in the work that we do as employment lawyers. And I guess what I didn't put in there is, if you're under a modern award, choosing the right one. That's probably the most fundamental question. Am I actually employing under the correct legal industrial instrument? But then once you get that right, is the person classified at the correct classification? Are they working up at higher duties and not being paid for it? Do they have the right hourly rate of pay? Then it's all about hours arrangements mostly. Overtime, shift, weekend work, span of hours. Do we have that kind of rostering structure and time and attendance right? Annualised salaries has been a huge and complex issue, and often there are allowances that people just forget to set up. And so you really need that professional setup in an HR enabling tool, and I guess you need to be audited regularly just to make sure that the alignment of those areas on this page stays in alignment and moves as things change. Just quickly about the enterprise bargaining system, it's pretty broken. It's a Labor government system. A lot of the stagnation of wages really comes from the fact that people aren't bargaining. And there are a number of things that need to be rebalanced to make that more effective. The rights of the parties should be limited to those directly involved in the enterprise. The social safety net, the better off overall test, needs to be an in the round kind of test rather than a line by line test. We've had formulations of that kind of test in the past and they've worked quite well. We have the highest minimum adult rate of pay in any OECD nation. And when you combine that with the NES and the award system, we're actually coming from a very high base point, and it makes it difficult to meet that in every respect and find gains for an employer. And so we just need to be cognizant of that. And obviously, registration should be simple and not legally technical. I'm going to hand over to Tracy now, who will take us through payroll best practice.
Thanks, Cam. Gee, that just makes me feel depressed, remembering how complicated this industry is that we work in. And it's always payroll's job to deliver all these things that Cam talked about. And sadly, too many employers still think that there's this magic button in the pay office that just happens to be able to manage all these complicated arrangements. So thank you for that, update. So a lot of people, ask me all the time, what does payroll best practice look like? It's actually quite hard to recognize payroll best practice or plan for it if you don't know what it looks like. But you certainly know when you don't have it, because a lot of employers sadly end up in the newspapers, and because journalists like to discuss, rotten employers underpaying staff. It's very newsworthy and they love the headlines. So we've seen many of these employers in the last couple of years get some pretty negative press coverage. And one of the things that we do a lot at Australian Payroll Association is work with employers to diagnose as to whether they actually do have an issue with underpayments. Generally when that happens, and in fact, in 100% of the cases where we have worked with employers to diagnose underpayments, this is typically the look on the face of the executives or the board of directors when we have to report back what we've found. People ask me all the time, are these employers doing these underpayments deliberately? And I can assure you that certainly all of the ones that we've worked with, there may well be employers that do take advantage of a complicated system and underpay deliberately. But of all the employers that we've worked with, we get genuine shock and horror when they realise that they've been underpaying their staff. Certainly it's something that if it's not on your risk register at your board of director level, it probably should be. Then invariably we get the excuses that happen. This is something that it generally is the one that we get the most, one that we hear the most, is that systems are blamed. It was our payroll system that let us down. The system did this big underpayment of many millions of dollars, and it's not really the system. And I really feel for technology vendors when their systems are blamed and people want to know what system a certain employer uses, because it's really completely irrelevant information. The real problem, of course, is a general lack of investment in the payroll function. This is very much around the employers not really understanding what it takes to deliver a compliant payroll operation in a business. So I wanted to really quickly go through the 3 areas that make up, in my view, payroll best practice. The first one is platforms. Look, we all need good payroll platforms and we need to make sure that they're fit for purpose. There's often the set and neglect mentality around payroll platforms. We set it up once, we spent a whole heap of money on consultants and technology, and we never checked it again. And so unfortunately, over a long period of time, even a small error over a large employee population can be a material number, which then, of course, if the media gets onto it and you're a known brand in Australia, you'll probably end up in the paper. But there's plenty that don't, but the Fair Work have got plenty of smaller employers as well that they've prosecuted in the past. And 9 times out of 10, the main thing that's happened is something's been set up in the time and attendance or payroll system that is incorrect because the person didn't have the right information at the time, or it's just been incorrectly entered. And that's just caused a long flow-on effect where, like I say, a very small error can often have very big consequences. But just like Bill Gates doesn't take responsibility for my terrible pivot tables in Excel, a payroll supplier, payroll technology vendor should not be taking responsibility for an employer using their product in an incorrect manner. The technology vendors are rarely to blame, and the payroll, and it's really up to each employer, I beg your pardon, to make sure that they've got fit for purpose technology for their payroll function. The second area that's really important in the payroll operation to ensure that you've got compliant payroll is processes. And this is not just the processes that happen in the pay office. This is processes from whenever anyone turns up for work. So if you've got 10 locations, you need to go and have a look at what happens in every single one of those locations, because they might well be different, and ask what happens when someone turns up for work. Follow that process right through to when that same person gets a pay slip. So one of the things that we like to look at is, when the obvious things are any manual processes. Where do you use paper? Where do you use spreadsheets? What isn't automated that could be? Maybe again, talk to your technology vendor. They might have done upgrades since you last implemented it, there could well be technology functionality that you don't know about that could automate some of the processes you do. But I've seen a lot of manual processes in pay offices that are really, really risky in terms of the payroll operation. In terms of governance and controls, I think that anyone who works in pay office needs to be above suspicion. So if your governance and controls don't completely protect your payroll team, they're not completely protecting your business. So what we like to do is have a look at your process and figure out how we can break it. Where could we, if we chose to, create fraudulent activity in the pay office? If someone can actually figure out a way to do that, then your governance and controls are not strong enough. But the key area in payroll to ensure compliance is your people. They are absolutely the key. They are the ones that that manage these systems. They are the ones that make the decisions. I'm often told, sometimes by technology vendors, that they can completely do away with anyone working in the pay office because their system just automates anything. And I'm here to tell you that's absolutely rubbish. And the reason that that's rubbish is because there are so many complexities there's so many of the states and territory legislation, federal legislation. It's just impossible for a system to automate everything. There are definitely decisions that have to happen in the pay office every day to make sure that your payroll is compliant. So people are really important in terms of making sure that works. We did a recent survey of payroll managers, and this is just some of the feedback that we got, and just to really give you some data on how complicated this system that it is running a payroll operation, and how payroll managers feel about that. So we see that 83% of payroll managers surveyed said that their responsibilities have grown more complex. And, Cam just talked about some of the changes, but, payroll in Australia is not getting any less complex anytime soon, as far as I can tell. We see again a vast majority of payroll managers found awards and legislation difficult to practically implement. Now, this is a classic example of things that legislators come up with that are just practically impossible to do in a pay office or in a piece of payroll technology. Or it could also be, my favorite example is when you've got a group of people in an organization who negotiate an EA, and you've got the unions on, you've got HR, you've got IR folk and your lawyers all on board, and everyone's high-fiving when they finish the EBA and it's all signed off, and then it just gets dumped in the pay office and someone says to the payroll manager, can you just implement this please? And again, very rarely, although it is increasing, but still rarely are payroll at that table to discuss what is actually able to be implemented and what is practically impossible to be implemented, because it's no point coming up with great ideas if we can't actually deliver them in the pay office. And again, more than half of the payroll managers surveyed said that they actually needed more training on legislation and the technical aspects of payroll. We believe that training is critical and it needs to be ongoing training. Just because you did training 15 years ago doesn't mean that that you're up to speed with you don't have current knowledge on payroll. So we very much believe in, as I say, ongoing training. So that is a must. Legislation changes regularly and best knowledge becomes best practice. So unless you're willing as an employer to continually invest in the training of your payroll team, you're highly likely to have problems with compliance in the future. One of the things that really concerns me, we do a benchmarking survey every year, and we, I think, are just on 10% last year, or this current benchmarking survey, which is not out yet because we need to do that. We got a bit bowled over by COVID and it went to the bottom of the to-do list, is competency-based qualifications. So around about 10%, just under 10% of people who work in the payroll function have a competency-based qualification to do that. Now, we know that if you've got so training is different to qualifications. We know that if you've got a competency-based qualification, such as a Certificate 4 in Payroll Administration or Diploma of Payroll Management, we know that you've got certain competencies and can do the job. Without that, we expect our HR colleagues, our finance colleagues, our IT colleagues to have competency-based qualifications. For some reason, the people that manage typically our largest expense and certainly our most important asset in the business, for some reason we don't expect the people that manage the paying of those staff, we don't expect them to be qualified, and it's something that Australian business needs to get their head around and make sure your payroll team have qualifications. And if they don't, support them into getting them, because that is the quickest way that you'll give your board of directors some comfort that your payroll is in good hands. So that was a bit of a rant, sorry about that, but I'm very passionate about these qualifications. So once you've addressed payroll platforms, processes and people, you are somewhat better off and being closer to having payroll best practice. There is only those three things. They are three big things. I don't shy away from that, but there's really only three things to get right in payroll. Your platforms, best platform for you is a fit for purpose platform without any manual intervention, or as little manual intervention as possible. Your processes need to be sound, they need to be tested, they need to be documented, and they need to have good governance and controls, and your people regularly trained, ideally qualified with a payroll qualification, and you will be a much more a less risk employer in terms of payroll compliance. Now it's my job now to pass over to Maureen, who is from Workforce Software.
Good morning to everyone on the webinar, and thank you to Cam and Enable HR and Tracy and the Australian Payroll Association. Workforce Software are delighted to be co-presenting with you on the webinar today. Now, before we get started, we will be running a quick poll just to get a gauge for areas of greatest interest, just as I go into my presentation. So if you could please just take the time to provide a quick response. I'll leave that running for about 20 to 30 seconds to get your feedback on your greatest concerns around workforce management right now. So we should have those results coming through very shortly. There we go. And I guess by a large amount, the area of greatest interest is really compliance with modern awards, followed next by rostering for a flexible workplace and managing the return to work. Lastly, by labour demand forecasting. Okay, so just getting into the presentation itself. There's this, just waiting for that to load. There we go. So Australia has one of the most complex award systems in the world. And as you've heard from both Cam and also Tracy, Australian companies have been finding it challenging keeping compliant with modern awards. And some of the largest employers have been in the news for underpaying their employees. Woolworths recently announced its underpayments to thousands of employees has blown out to 390 million. Super Retail Group underpaid employees to the tune of 61.2 million, and Michael Hill 25 million, and so on. And really this has resulted in companies reviewing their application of their awards, their workforce management policies and processes, and the solutions that they have in place or require to fix this issue. So, with an increase of high-profile cases where employees have been insufficiently paid under annualised salary agreements, on the 1st of March 2020, the Fair Work Commission changed the annualised salary provisions for 19 modern awards. So what is an annualised salary? A little bit of background and why were these formed? Well, annualised salaries allow an employer to pay its employees a fixed annual salary, which provides the employee's salary will not result in the employee being paid less than if they had been paid according to the minimum weekly wages, allowances, overtime, penalty rates, etc., applicable under their award. This decade-old practice was mutually beneficial, reducing the administrative burden for employers, whilst at the same time providing employees with certainty of their income for each pay period. The Fair Work Commission decided to tighten controls to ensure employees are paid fairly. And so that's what I'll encompass next, really. What are the obligations from an employer perspective? So the new annualised salary provisions apply only to full-time workers who are paid an annual wage under one of the identified awards. And so what are the obligations for employers? Well, employers need to make sure their employees' annual wage is high enough to cover the award entitlements that they've included in the arrangement. They must keep a written award of the annualised salary being paid and the provisions of the award covered by the annualised salary, along with any calculations and assumptions used, and the outer limit of hours an employee would have to work before becoming eligible for additional pay for overtime and penalty payments. Employers must also keep a written record of the start and finish times, including unpaid breaks for each employee. So employees are required then to sign off or acknowledge the record is accurate in writing for each pay cycle. Employers are also required to perform an annual reconciliation every 12 months from the commencement of the agreement and the end of the agreement or at termination of employment. Any unpaid wages must then be paid within 14 days. Employers also need to pay separately as overtime entitlements any hours worked beyond the limit by an employee during any pay period or roster cycle. So a little bit about workforce software. Who are we and how do we work with customers to help solve some of these issues? Workforce software is a provider of workforce management solutions in the cloud that digitise time and labour processes, optimise demand-driven scheduling, simplify absence management, and enable strategic business insight. And we partner with customers to deploy the best possible solution to their unique workforce management needs. With respect to the annualised salaries, our solution can easily capture worked time, maintaining a written record of start and finish times, including unpaid breaks for each employee, using either clock terminals, mobile devices or tablets, the web application, timesheet entry, or integrating with existing clocks, for example. The worked time can then be interpreted against a roster to apply any penalties such as overtime, weekend rates, allowances. We can apply planned and unplanned time off, which can then be approved by employees and managers, acknowledging the record is accurate for each pay cycle. Our solution can also provide a reconciliation against annualised salary. So this can also be run on an annual cycle or on an ad hoc basis, such as at the end of an agreement or termination of employment, and any underpayments are then sent through to payroll for processing. So a little bit about the company. Workforce Software are headquartered in the US and have been operating in Australia and New Zealand for nearly 15 years. We have 3.6 million users spread across 65 countries and a 97% retention rate. We are a multi-tenant cloud solution with a local data centre in Sydney, and our solution employs a world-class user experience. It uses a data-effective, future-proof rules engine. It uses artificial intelligence and has a built-in assistant. It provides labour forecasting and roster optimisation. It helps simplify compliance and is scalable for future growth needs. We partner with and integrate with a large number of leaders in human capital management and payroll solutions such as Workday, Oracle, SAP, ADP and Ascender, Datacom, Cornerstone, and so on. And Workforce Software has received recognition as a leader amongst the analyst reports. For 2 years in a row, we've been named as the #1 solution for workforce management users by Infotech. So a quick touch on our solution, then I will actually be going into some more detail about how we can utilise solutions in the return to work and the complexities associated with that. So our solution, the Workforce Suite, it uses a mobile-first design principle. It has a single responsive user interface that looks and functions great on any device. The Workforce Hub, which you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, allows employers and managers to take action and to quickly and easily take action on what is most important. The Workforce Assistant is an AI tool which enables managers to be more productive in the moment. It brings attention to the highest priority tasks and it proactively advises. For example, if an employee hasn't shown up for work, well, that may have an impact on health and safety compliance. So that's presented to the manager and the manager can then take action quickly, contact that employee, look to replace them quickly. or if an employee hasn't clocked out and is entering overtime, this equates to an unplanned cost for the business. So it's advising of those sorts of things that may come up proactively. Rostering allows you to forecast your labour demand, to improve business performance, and also to reduce operational costs. So whether you want to view a roster for a single team or 50 sites or stores, it's designed to scale. And it also supports the legislative requirements, including things like work hour limits, required rest periods, skills required to perform roles, and so on. And the time and attendance component is where work time can be captured, interpreted against a roster to apply any penalties, capture any unplanned and planned time off, and improve that process as well. And the key benefits, I guess, really of that area of the solution are around reducing compliance risk and labour costs, improving operational efficiency, and providing an engaging user experience with the ability for employees to confirm their calculations are correct before being processed through to payroll. With respect to compliance, we have a highly configurable rules engine, which incorporates both a library of localised payrolls for Australia and also allows for configuration of effective date-driven rules as well. And as mentioned, we support the changes to the annualised salary arrangements that came into effect in March. So top of mind for businesses right now is how they can return to work and remain responsive to operate in a changing environment and constantly changing environment due to COVID-19. If you think about some of the challenges that we're facing in Australia right now, suburbs are being locked down. States are closing borders to try and manage the current pandemic. How we can help, Workforce Software can help organisations by reducing the risk of exposure by using pre-shift health screening, which protects employees' privacy and either clears them to report to a work site or provides the next steps if clearance is denied. We also support contact tracing, so identifying individuals who may have been in contact with a co-worker who has reported exposure or who's been diagnosed with COVID-19. We also notify employees who have potentially been exposed to an affected colleague with a survey link to determine the risk of exposure. For example, were they in the same department? Were they in the same building or break room as another employee who has been exposed or potentially exposed to COVID-19? And then we can suggest the next steps based on official guidelines. Another important part is really employee sentiment. So we have the ability to capture employee sentiment regarding safety and support at work. And this can have an impact on the engagement and productivity of employees in the workplace. So what we can do using technology is we can conduct a survey that's sent to employees to gauge how employees are feeling about a return to on-site work and address any concerns in advance. We can understand how employees feel about the safety measurements, the safety measures in place during their shift. For example, social distancing, access to personal protection equipment, and cleaning and sanitation efforts. Another area that we can help is enabling responsible rostering for a safe work experience. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, organisations have had to change how they deliver products and services, introduce stringent cleaning and sanitation procedures, and adjust their staffing levels. Well, the rostering solution can help you adopt a phased approach to returning to work. So whether that be through what-if scenarios and rostering, alternating days of co-workers coming into work sites, staggering the start and end times of shifts to promote social distancing, creating gaps between shifts to limit exposure, and then offering contactless time collection and so on. And lastly, also helping employers manage an increase in absenteeism. So employee absenteeism and leave events have increased exponentially as part of this current pandemic. And that's really forced employers to fill gaps in essential roles and stay abreast with rapidly changing leave laws. The Workforce Suite helps ease this impact with simplified compliance and streamlined case management for continuous or intermittent leaves of absence, advanced rostering techniques to promote knowledge transfer and easy management of flexible rosters that give employees the freedom to manage personal responsibilities whilst also meeting their work obligations. So this is a little bit from, I guess, a technology vendor and how we partner with our customers to help support them, both in managing their compliance around awards and also in the current times with the return to work. But it is very much a partnership, and as Tracy highlighted earlier, it's an important partnership for both the payroll teams to work with their technology vendors to support those needs, to keep compliant, whilst also supporting any unique needs that the business may have as well. And with that, I will hand back to the Enable HR team to run the Q&A session.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks for the presentations, guys, Maureen, Campbell, and Tracy. Really interesting stuff there, guys. I will encourage everyone. There's still time to submit questions. We've actually had some good questions come through. Some are are interesting, and I'm actually excited to ask them. Put everyone to the test a little bit, I think. But I'll pose the first question, and I think it's probably one that could be answered by the group. And the question is, if I have a known compliance issue or problem, how do I best manage it?
I'm happy to lead off.
Sure.
Look, it can actually be a pretty complicated assessment, Andrew. I think normally it would involve some kind of audit to quantify the size and scale of the problem. It would require a assessment of the risk appetite for the organisation in terms of the way that they want to manage. We'd normally recommend getting some privilege over it, just in case it's something that you don't want to publicly disclose or you want to try and fix it. There are decisions about sort of telling the regulator to come in. Do you invite them in? Do you try and fix your own problem? So it's actually normally a pretty complicated discussion with a board or C-suite around that kind of thing.
I completely agree. My first advice would, other than after quantifying or after diagnosing the issue and perhaps quantifying it, the next thing that we normally recommend is to speak to your employment lawyer, because there are strategies around, there are good strategies and actually some not so good strategies that really I wouldn't be, if it were me, I certainly wouldn't be doing it on my own. I'd be putting a strategy together, and that potentially, depending on who you are, might include a media strategy, but your employment lawyer needs to be across it.
Another question for the group. Do you have any more information regarding casual leave entitlements following the federal court ruling?
I know nothing.
Okay. I might throw that to you, Cam.
Righto. So look, it's a complex area. So what the decision actually said was the classic definition that somebody's a casual if they're engaged as such and paid as such. So I call you a casual and I pay you a casual loading. That casual loading is designed to compensate you for a range of things that you don't get. You've got insecure employment, you don't get annual leave, you don't get personal leave and those kinds of things. What the courts have said is, when you read the definition of the National Employment Standard and you are a regular and systematic casual, you can also pick up the entitlements that a permanent employee would expect to get, even though you're being paid the casual loading. So that's the tension, sort of turning back about 50 years of classic definition of casual employment. So it's gone through the federal court, the full federal court, and is now up in the High Court, where the company, backed by a range of people, are looking to try and overturn that decision and go back to what people would have thought before. I pay you a casual loading to compensate you for these entitlements, therefore you don't get them. And that applies whether you're a regular and systematic casual over a long period of time or not. So if the High Court overturns it, we'll go back to what we knew before. If they don't, it really then leaves it to the government to try and put through a statutory change to take us back to what people understood casual employment was before these kinds of decisions. So it's a complex area, about $14 billion of potential underpayment exposure, according to the evidence of the AIG.
A couple of questions came through during that response. One of them is how would you differentiate?
So the main way you're going to differentiate is the regular and systematic nature of how a casual's engaged and the length of time they're engaged. And so things like, do they have to apply for leave? So the classic definition of a casual is you're hired and fired by the day. You in effect start a new contract of employment every day. Now, in reality, we know that there are many employees who are employed in the kind of longer term, and I guess the view is that they lose that kind of casual nature of their employment. So it's mostly about how regular and systematic are they employed and the length of time they're employed to pick up that entitlement.
Okay. Another question for the group. Do you think Fair Work will revisit the compliance and complexities around annualised salary arrangements under a modern award?
Might be Jürgen, Cam.
Well, it's look,
we've seen no evidence of it.
No, I mean, I can't see Fair Work changing that, that position in the short or medium term. It's a really interesting and complex problem about the collision of the award system and the way that people want to work in a modern workplace. It's about autonomy and trust and engagement and discretionary effort vis-a-vis, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or even an annualised salary kind of concept. So the award system's kind of taking us back into the dark ages a bit. And it's a pretty recent decision. It was argued pretty fully. I can't see Fair Work changing that in even the medium term.
I agree. I think the only changes will be an extension to the modern awards that, other than the current list we've got. So it's probably possibly going to get more complicated before it gets less complicated.
Yeah, we've got about 19 awards to which that annualised salary kind of structure works. They're actually in 3 different categories, which vary a bit. But yeah, you're right. There's 120 modern awards or something like that. So we could see an extension to other industries.
And just while we're on annualised salary, another question here is, how do you manage employees' hours, for example, when they are award covered, but on an annualised salary and they are working remotely? I think that's
one for Maureen. I don't know.
It is challenging when people are working remotely, being able to determine how many hours are really being worked. And so, you do need to have a process in place where you are capturing those worked hours. So, I've heard in some countries in Asia Pacific, people are wanting to capture the sign-on time on a computer and the sign-off time, but there's arguments around that say, well, just because they've logged on, does that mean they are really working? Whereas there also needs to be somewhat of a trust. So if you have a process in place where you have employees and that process means they need to clock on, so whether it's via a mobile device, whether it's via the web application associated with their workforce management solution, that clocking on is the accurate record of the start and end times for that employee. And that is what is used by solutions to determine what are those worked hours. And you can determine also, you can clock on, clock off for breaks and so on. As I said, there are some countries considering ways in which they complement that data side by side. And that's something that we have done in Japan, for example, complement that data side by side with informational data that takes a input from logging on and logging off data. But that's not the primary source of record for the worked hours, but it's just additional information. But I don't see that as something that's commonly requested here in Australia. And culturally, I don't think it's something that has really come up as a requirement in the workplace here in Australia.
Great. So I think, Andrew, from our perspective, not so much from a client compliance perspective, but from a employee welfare perspective, there's a bit of evidence coming through that people working remotely and at home can fall into the trap of working excess kind of hours. So we're kind of recommending that managers check in with their team, for a daily stand up, not just around doing the tasks, but around how people are going. It's definitely a more kind of stressful environment and world we're living in, and I think managers should have that responsibility to check in about how their team's going, as well as are you doing the tasks that you need to do to fulfil your role.
Yeah, and that's where we're seeing like some of the legal changes that came in, outside of Australia and the Asia Pacific region, where there was a concern that people are doing too many hours, more hours than less. So in Japan, they had new legislation come in April last year around capturing ongoing overtime month to month. So monthly averages, companies need to report that back because they were having situations where, they called it death by overwork, where they had situations where people were working far too many hours. And it wasn't too uncommon, and that's why they made the law change to help prevent that.
Another question that's come through also as well, everyone attending, if we don't get to your question, we'll certainly endeavour to provide some response post the session. So, please feel free to keep them coming through. I think we've probably got time for a couple more. One that's come through is, was there any more word on the part-time personal leave accrual?
So I'm not sure, mate. I'd have to investigate that, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay. Have a look at some other ones. If an employee does not fall under your EA, but would fall under another award, would these employees need an annual reconciliation?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend. So there's 19 awards that have that annualised salary provision that require you to record start and finish time and hours and reconcile annually against the award. So if they fell outside the EBA and they were covered by one of those 19 awards, the answer would be yes. If they weren't covered by one of those 19 awards, it would be unlikely. In saying that, you'd need to meet the hours and penalty rate structure of whatever that award was.
And just the final question. I'm concerned about workplace health and safety problems in any return to location-based work. Can I require an employee to give me their COVID test results?
Well, that's a clanger. Look, I mean, I think the answer is yes. So an employer has a duty to ensure that their workplace is a health and safety workplace for employees, and that means not only an employee who might be have COVID and be unwell, but for everybody else in there. I don't see that an employer can discharge that duty if there's a concern that somebody may have the COVID virus and they're needing to or wanting to or required to come back into location-based work. I think probably the biggest challenge is if you had an employee who refused, what then do you do with them? Can you, does it give right to terminate? Can you direct them to do that? Can you refuse to let them come back to work and otherwise stand them down, that kind of thing? But obviously, moving back into location-based work has a certain level of risk at the moment, and being able to trace and ensure people are well in the workplace is critically important.
I'll throw one more question out to the group. Very, very topical at the moment. Are there any specifics of the newly announced pandemic leave?
And look, I haven't had a really good look at it, but there certainly are specifics. I thought it was directed to aged care.
I thought so too in the first.
But I actually haven't read the status of the leave. My understanding is that in aged care, many of the frontline healthcare workers have kind of been locked into facilities to be able to care for, you know, the elderly without sort of coming out and creating either risk to people out in society or bringing risk back into the facility. And so my guess is the leave is additional leave associated with people having to be kind of work in those structures to protect the elderly with elderly residents. But I haven't read the order.
Yeah, no, awesome. So look, I know we've gone over a few minutes, so appreciate everyone staying on to post your questions and join us for the Q&A session. There's definitely some questions that have come through that I didn't get a chance to put to the panel. But like I said, we'll certainly do our best to come back with some responses post the session as well. There's some, as Cam put it, some clangers in there for sure. But that's great. I mean, that's really what you want to have in these sessions, is promote that kind of thought, and obviously have people coming forward with these types of questions, because, you know, as everyone touched on, it's an incredibly complex landscape, and, you know, it's ever changing and it's becoming ever more complicated. So I'd like to thank Maureen, Campbell and Tracy for spending your time today with us and fielding questions, and also the presentations. And also would like to thank all of the attendees for coming and joining us this morning. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew.
You'll be hearing from us soon.
Cheers.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, everyone.
See you, folks.
Bye.